Good evening, everyone. Thank you for that fulsome welcome. I'm very pleased to be speaking in a series on great voyages. And in some ways, this talk or lecture is a bit of a voyage in and of itself. I'll explain that and say more about that in a minute. The first thing that I want to talk about, or at least make clear, is that there is a narrative or a story to world history and Atlantic history that follows or is contained by the number 1492. I think you know where I'm going when I say that. There also is a story and there is a coherence to that narrative around the Atlantic and the Americas. What's really intriguing is that there is a world historical dimension to this narrative. And in some ways, it certainly was the case with me, when I was taught this history and when I was taught this story of European expansion, I was only taught half of the story. And what I mean by that is the Christopher Columbus part, the Atlantic part, and the Americas. What I'm going to be talking about in a minute is adding in the Asia part. And in some ways, the metaphor that I thought of to think about this and to describe this is, you know, if this is the book that contains the history of European expansion, when I was taught that book, or when I read from that book, I kind of was only reading from pages on one side, right? That there was another area of material that I really wasn't touching when I was in high school and maybe even later in college. So this lecture is an attempt to provide you with a sense of European expansion as something that's part of a worldwide process. So that's my initial introduction, and also bringing the Portuguese as imperialist, expansionists, Europeans who are spanning the globe into the frame. Again, that there's a linguistic difference or distinction that kind of places the Portuguese as the odd man out in the story of colonialism. All right. What do I want to do? All right. So this is my slide that's an image of Ferdinand Magellan for us. It's an image, as you can see, from 1695. It's way after his death. As you can see, the image comes out of a text that is about scientific societies in Europe, published in Northern Europe. Magellan is depicted as a specific kind of European figure and explorer. He's clearly a maritime figure, right? The ocean is in the background. But he really is presented as a figure in a narrative about science, I would argue. And I'll talk more about how he's placed within different narratives in a second. It's clearly an idealized depiction of him, but I think it's an interesting and useful image of him. He's got the accoutrements of navigation. He has a chart as well as his compass, and there's also visible there, right, a depiction of the Magellanic cloud, which he observed in his circumnavigation. Let me give you some context. So his dates are 1480 to 1521. I think perceptive readers or perceptive members of the audience will note that his death year falls within the engaged years of 1519 to 1522. I'll say more about that. I just am giving you some ideas of contextual information for Magellan. He's engaged in the post-Vasco da Gama Asian endeavors. If we're going to talk in terms of analogies, Vasco da Gama is the analogy for the Portuguese world and for Asia of Christopher Columbus. He's the person who opens up both sea routes and trade routes in Asia and specifically in India. And in that way, he is let's call him the progenitor of a really complex process of engagement, trade, and colonization. Magellan is involved in that process that really starts in 1494 or so, and is ongoing at the time that Magellan is engaging in his circumnavigation in 1519. Magellan is present at the Battle of Malacca, which I'll say more about, in 1511. Portugal opens trade with the Malacca Islands for spices as part of this process of expansion. So Magellan really is a player in this process of Portuguese expansion into Asia, which is intriguing. What's really interesting for us are the last two elements. Ferdinand Magellan actually becomes a Spanish citizen in 1517. One of the reasons he does that is because his ideas for opening trade in Asia, or continuing to open trade in Asia, are more welcome in the Spanish court than they are in the Portuguese court at that point in time. It's a really complex process through which he fell out of favor in Portugal because of rivalries with other expansionists, let's call them. So what I'm trying to get across in this slide is that the Portuguese really do establish a template through the use of, let's call it anodyne exploration, the engagement in trade, and acts of conquest to establish themselves and insert themselves in a system, in a process of oceanic trade within Asia. Magellan is a part of that process, but becomes an odd man out in that process. There are a series of developments that begin to happen in the Portuguese world without him, and he turns to the Spanish monarchy in order to get money for the things he wants to do. In 1518, the Spanish monarchy provides him with a license and directs him to open the spice trade. And specifically, you know, that makes it sound kind of neutral. Go forth, open the spice trade. What the Spanish monarchy is really doing is trying to frustrate the near monopoly that Portugal has established in the spice trade as a result of these events and processes that really get going after 1504 or so. So the period between 1504 and 1511 is structural and formative. Magellan becomes an independent operator after 1517 and attaches himself to the Spanish monarchy. All right, so what I really am doing, and my great intellectual voyage as a part of this process, is I want to kind of direct us to understand the various perspectives under which Magellan can be understood, and I want to direct us to a particular one that I think is helpful and useful. So Magellan fits into, again, what I've been calling narratives or structures in thinking about the past. He fits really well in the history of the sea, the maritime history of the world, the history of exploration. He definitely has a place, and you can draw, right, the start point and end point, however you wish, right, in the history of exploration. That can go back to the Greeks, it can go further back to ancient Egypt, and it can go as far as you wish it can be in the present day or even the future, right? That Magellan does fit in a broad, connected narrative that includes seafarers, ancient seafarers, and modern astronauts. He also fits in what I'm calling a linked narrative in the history of science. What I have in quotes there, right, the humankind's emergence from the Dark Ages, which is in quotes, to modernity, which is also in quotes. So figures like Magellan, Columbus, and others are seen to be actors and agents in this complex process through which science emerged as something that changed human life and experience. The fourth one that I have there, right, he's a player in the history of European expansion and European colonialism. Again, that's a process that is long. We can think, talk, and argue about when it began. We can also do the same thing with when it ended. But for our purposes, right, it's really clear that Magellan is a figure in a way of framing the past under the history of European colonialism. The last one is the one that it's a great voyage of perspective that I'm inviting you to take with me this evening. And it's to understand Magellan and his circumnavigation within an ethno-historical history of the world. And what I mean by that is the history of encounters and specifically understanding non-European motivations. There are interactions, engagements, and confrontations with non-Europeans that are key structural elements of Magellan's story, his circumnavigation, and of course his death. And I think an ethno-historical approach is an approach that helps us understand what non-Europeans were doing and why they did it. So I have a little bit more to say about an ethno-historical approach. It's an attempt, again, to address complex encounters and events in the past from a value-neutral point of view. And I think it'll become clear what that point really means. It's an attempt to understand motivations. It's an attempt to understand why things happened, when they did, and how. It's an attempt to frame non-indigenous peoples as having politics and polities, but it is, in the end, an attempt to think through and urge you to think through kind of a radical shift in perspectives, if I can say that. And the important element is that it's value neutral. As you'll see, and as I'll say a little bit more, the sources that we have that describe Magellan's activities, what he did, how he did it, why he did it, how he died, are not value neutral, right? They are most decidedly not value neutral. In fact, they place Magellan's activity, his life, what he did, and his death in a kind of a providential narrative. Which is fine and we accept and we read through, but the story might be more complex if we add other perspectives to the frame. So that's my description of the voyage, or the intellectual voyage that I'm inviting you to take with me as we examine, explore, and think through Magellan and his actions. As I was reviewing my notes, going over my thoughts about Ferdinand Magellan, I realized that he's kind of a node of a series of contradictions that I think are good to think with. That's a phrase from Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist. The first one being that, as I said, Magellan is a Portuguese-born mariner who embarks on an earth-shattering process of exploration for the Spanish crown. Second contradiction that I think is good to think with is that his crew was, again, not uniformly Spanish. It was not made up of a uniform body of men. It was a polyglot crew, a multilingual crew, and I think also points to the second point, which is that that's also a useful way of thinking of the Spanish Empire at this time and the Portuguese endeavor, that even though these were national endeavors managed by monarchies, that they did incorporate a wide variety of individuals as well as investors in the endeavors. Third contradiction is Spain, Castile, and the establishment of an empire. This gets us back to the point I was making about the Spanish, perhaps, and the 1492 moment being paradigmatic for us. Portugal doesn't really fit a model of a strictly territorial empire that's based upon continuing and further conquest or colonization. It's a different sort of place. It's organized around maritime trade and the control of trade routes and shipping routes.